Hello, I'm Dylan.
And I'm Kiyan.
And this is Triple Play, that podcast with no dialogue at all, because this week we watched the Kotsi Trilogy.
With cinematography by Ron Fricke.
Directed by Godfrey Reggio, with music by Philip Glass.
And released in 1982, 1988, and 2002.
The Kotsi Trilogy. Definitely the most unique trilogy we've watched for Triple Play, shall we say.
Definitely. I think this is the first, cinematographic, movie series I've ever watched. I've never really watched this type of, dialogueless, documentary-esque thing before. But I know it's a genre, perhaps prompted by these movies in part.
Yeah, I think Koyaanisqatsi is one of the first that helped really establish this genre that Wikipedia calls like a visual tone poem.
Right.
But I think a lot of people refer to it as a documentary. I watched Koyaanisqatsi on Turner Classic Movies, the TV channel, actually, because by sheer coincidence, it was on this week that we were recording this.
Oh, wow.
And that actually ended up being pretty useful because on TCM you get these introductions by Bill Mankiewicz where he talks a little bit about the history of the movie and the history of the director usually. And I'm going to draw information from that later in this episode for that. But one of the things is that he did actually call this a documentary picture in his little introduction. So
interesting, yeah. Especially, we'll get into this probably in a bit, but Ron Fricke has gone on record saying, there was no rhyme or reason to anything we shot. I just shot whatever I thought would look good.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. But before we get into any of that, let's talk about how much we've seen these movies before, which should be a really short segment as usual.
Never.
I had never seen all of them in their entirety. The only thing I had seen from them was that I had seen the Prudigal segment of Koyaanisqatsi before. I took an architecture class in undergrad.
Oh wow!
Fun fact: it was like an architecture of my campus, which I'm not going to say because I still go there. But it was architecture of the campus basically, and the person who taught it tried to also give us a general background on a lot of the architecture on campus is in this brutalist style. So he wanted to give us history of similar style buildings, and the Prudigal housing development was one of those. And he was teaching it to us as this is what happens when you have a failure of architecture, basically. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on because turns out that was the first segment of the movie shot, but we're not quite there yet.
Right. This movie also has one shot, as far as I could tell, of Kowloon Walled City, which is another, architectural, monument. It doesn't exist anymore, but is just a very strange place. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I guess that's a good lead into actually talking about the first movie, but I want to start by talking about Godfrey Reggio first, because I think he's a very interesting character, and his history kind of leads into this movie. And so I actually found it quite beneficial to learn from good old Ben Mankiewicz a little bit of his history before watching the movie, because I was able to look at the movie with that in mind.
Yeah.
Basically, he was a monk, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Before we jump into that, Wikipedia alerted me to the fact that he's actually the descendant of this Italian nobleman or something, who was I don't want to say moved because that has a modern connotation, but went to France and became a very famous person who served the French government or something.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And one of his other descendants, also, this is all according to Wikipedia or whatever their sources are, but one of his other descendants was this Confederate general.
Wow.
Yeah. But anyway, go on to what you
Yeah,
were
no,
going to describe.
he's a monk. He was a monk
Yeah,
for a long time.
14 years I read.
Yeah, 14 years, and he did all the monk stuff, like not talking and all of that. And Ben Mankiewicz in his little introduction basically talked about how this long period of not talking was what kind of led Reggio down this, shall we say, thought path. Because Reggio, basically, when he created this movie and his company, said that he believed that language was losing its meaning, essentially. That language was losing its meaning to represent concepts and the human race. And so that's why he founded this company called IRE, which for some reason I didn't actually write down what that stands for. But he founded this company called IRE that basically specialized in making these visual tone poems, if we're going to use that vernacular.
It's Institute for Regional Education.
Right. In New Mexico, I should mention. And, well, they did an ad campaign funded by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, basically in the early 70s, basically warning of the oncoming prevalence of technology and government surveillance, basically. And
yeah,
there's about a 25-minute sort of mini documentary about the making of Koyaanisqatsi, where Reggio, it's essentially an interview with Reggio, and I watched about half of it. It's from Koyaanisqatsi.org, which is the main kind of portal for this website and the what is apparently the Koyaanisqatsi project. And he talks a lot about how this early ad campaign is what really set the tone for the stuff he would make in the future, because it was very similar in style. And on that ad campaign is where he actually met Ron Fricke, because Ron Fricke was someone who came to the IRE and as a cinematographer and helped shoot the footage for this campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, the ACLU pulled out of the campaign when the campaign was kind of over, and I read that the IRE had about $40,000 left in their bank account, and the ad campaign was they didn't have the contract to do it anymore, and Fricke was the one who suggested to Reggio, like, well, how about we use it to make a movie? And
right. But I mean, imagine like it sounds like I read that too, and that sounded so like dumb to me. Like, hey, we have this money that we could use to be doing good, or at least what we consider to be good. Let's make a movie. Especially like, but then, you know, you kind of get the impression like, okay, whatever, they plan to like use the movie to promote these sort of ideas. But then you get the stuff from Ron Fricke of like, yeah, we just shot whatever, man. Like, we just shot anything we could find. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, well, Fricke, he was clearly like, we just shot what looked good on the film.
Yeah, that's what he said. We shot whatever would look good.
Ben Mankiewicz basically said that, and I saw this corroborated by other sources, that Reggio and Fricke basically went around America filming what they considered to be, quote, wonders, unquote, you know, of the human race.
Mm-hmm.
And they started filming 1975, and they started filming on 16 millimeter film. And they ran out of budget. But during this time, this is when they shot the demolition of the Prudigal housing complex in what is actually my favorite segment, or one of my favorite segments of the first movie. That segment is very interesting, becomes, I think, even more interesting when you know the background behind it. And I actually think that there are more scenes in the first movie like that I wish that I knew like more of the background behind them before watching the movie, and learning a lot of them after watching the movie. Maybe want to go back and rewatch them. But anyway, if you don't know about the Prudigal housing complex, essentially it's in Chicago. Sorry, not Chicago, St. Louis, St. Louis, depending on your pronunciation. And basically, in the 50s, they had a big homeless problem, and the council was like, well, we'll build public housing, and they hired this architectural firm, and they designed this housing complex. And the original plan was so Pruitt was a African-American World War II veteran, and Ego was a former U.S. congressman. So the plan was for the Pruitt housing to be for African-Americans / black people, according to the council, and the Ego apartments to be for white people. Eventually, they just merged them into the Pruitt Ego housing complex and just shoved all the poor people in there. It was a total failure. It's considered one of the most famous failures of urban redevelopment ever, because within 5 years, it was already falling apart. The elevators only stopped on the first, 4th, 7th, and 10th floors, and you had to take the stairs to get to the other floors. The first, 4th, 7th, and 10th floors were also the only floors with the laundry rooms and the garbage chutes in order to try and ease congestion on some of the more condensed floors. And just the apartments were designed to be very small, with very small kitchen areas, and basically, it basically just fell apart within 5 years, and within 15 to 20, they were planning to tear it down, and then basically exactly 20 years after they went up, they tore them down, as you can see in the movie. Occupancy maxed out at about 97%, I think, or in the 90s, and then like immediately started dropping, and after like 3 years, it never really exceeded 60% again, and by the end, there were only 500 people in 8 or 9 of the buildings.
Yeah, this sounds a lot. So actually, I didn't know any of this, but I mean, it sounds a lot like, or there are at least some similarities to. It doesn't sound a lot like, but there's some similarities to, Kowloon Walled City here, which, if you don't know, is I think it's in one shot of this movie. I think, but it's basically this place that used to be in Hong Kong, which was like, I forget, it was like a third of a mile square or something, and there was like 40,000 people living there, and it was like 11-story. Imagine like skyscrapers, but they're actually just like shacks stacked on top of one another, like with no input from architects or anything. Basically, just like leaning against one another, and it's a crazy place. Like you can look it up. Like there was no sunlight on the bottom floors. It was like this cyberpunk like looking place. And it's just a very strange place. Yeah,
there's a lot of this low income housing in the first movie, because I'm sure there are more shots of other weird low income housing projects. Prudigal's one of the most famous. So
yeah, that's the most famous one. Weirdly, I knew in the back of my mind that like that was I knew like the name Pruitt Ego. And like I knew that it was somehow related to this movie, but I didn't like exactly know what it was. Somehow. So like even though it's weird though that like this movie is kind of in the public consciousness, at least the first one at least. Because like I kind of knew that already somehow, and I never watched these. And like I posted a picture from this movie online with no context, and I didn't mention the name of the movie. I just posted it. And someone was like, "Oh, Koyaanisqatsi." I was like, "Whoa."
Well, the cinematography is very unique.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think partially because this movie is some of, if not the only, extant footage of Pruitt Ego being demolished, and many people who study urban redevelopment and gentrification and fun topics like that pretty much always study Pruitt Ego, because it's like the most famous failure of that kind of idea, and a lot of people have a lot of theories as to why that is, and I'm not going to get into that because it's not my field of expertise, but
it's never stopped us before.
It's very interesting because if you go and look at the pictures of Pruitt Ego without it getting demolished, like when it opened, it's very weird and like a dystopian future, because it's just these concrete buildings with all this space around them, this empty space around them. Like it's weird. It makes me uncomfortable in a strange way. And apparently the original plan was for them to be like flanked by, quote, a river of trees, unquote. And that's a quote from the architect. And that like never materialized because the buildings were built by like the cheapest construction company possible. So,
Yeah, it just, I think, all plays into the sort of life out of balance thing that this movie goes for. At least there are these shots. I don't know where in the world this is, but I think this is in the first one if I'm not mistaken. But there's these shots of like sort of like skyscraper. I guess these are apartments, like very high income, like place to live, and then like right next to that, there's just like this slum. I don't know if you remember that.
It's got to be New York or L.A.
Yeah,
I actually did watch this with my roommate because it was on TCM, so we were watching it on TV. TCM has no ads, so there were no ad breaks. But he has been to New York multiple times, so he was like, "Oh yeah, that's New York." In a lot of the movie, where I was like, "I don't know what that is." Mm-hmm. He was like, "Oh, that's New York."
Yeah, because they did shoot most of this in New York and LA. Because Reggio, I think, actually moved to LA during the production of this. Mm-hmm. During the 7-year production.
Yeah. Well, so after running out of budget, they drummed up some more funding, and on the new funding, they shot on 35 millimeter film, which apparently, in post processing, they did some manipulation of the 35 millimeter film to make it look more similar to the 16 millimeter, so you wouldn't notice the difference between the two when you were watching the movie. Mm-hmm. Apparently, some of the film they developed in a specific way to really draw out the shadows, because apparently the 16 millimeter film was better at capturing shadow than the 35 millimeter film, so they had to do some sort of special development process. I didn't look too much into it, but that was interesting. But I think the most interesting technological thing they did for the first movie was that Ron Fricke basically built a machine to do time-lapse recording in motion. One of the most, to me, technologically amazing shots in the movie was a time-lapse where the camera pans between two, it's looking down one street and then pans to its left to look down the other street. And that shot where it's a time lapse, but it's also panning at the same time, and it looks totally smooth. The pan is totally smooth. I was like, damn, really wonder how they did that. And apparently he built a motor that moved the camera a very precise amount between each shot to the correct place to get the pan to work out. And they shot it, I think, at one frame every second and a half, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because, when you think back to The Matrix and the creation of the bullet time thing, the bullet time technique, mm-hmm. is that ended up being used in other movies and being pretty influential. This movie is obviously pretty influential in its own right, but I wonder how much this thing that was invented for this movie was actually used in other movies, and I would imagine not that much.
Probably
it's a very
not
specific
that much.
use. It's a very specific use case. With bullet time, the reason that's also a pretty specific use case, but the big thing about that is that you can create these slow motion shots from multiple angles and don't have to edit out I guess you would have to edit out the other cameras and such, but yeah, I don't know. I actually don't remember now that I bring it up, but yeah, I mean, I don't know how much this was used in other movies.
Well, the thing about bullet time is that it was easily generalizable, I guess, right? You use slow motion a lot in movies. You don't really use time-lapse photography typically in a movie.
Right.
Which is probably why maybe this didn't get, this technique didn't see as much widespread use as bullet time.
Well, in terms of the most amazing non-technological thing that happened in the making of this movie, so Ron Fricke, and I believe Reggio as well, had relocated to LA, and they somehow got Francis Ford Coppola to watch the movie.
Well, yeah, I read that he had heard, was through the grapevine about the movie and was curious to see what it was like, and decided to ask Reggio if he could see it. So Reggio set up a private showing for him.
Right.
Apparently.
And he watched it and loved it. And that's how it was distributed.
Yeah, because Reggio didn't think he was going to be able to release Koyaanisqatsi to theaters. It was just going to be, kind of guerrilla marketing, indie kind of stuff. And then Francis Ford Coppola was like, oh, I really like this movie. I'm going to slap my name on it. And that's what really gave it the clout it needed to get into theaters.
Right. So that was my question. I didn't bother, I guess, looking up an answer to this, or maybe I just wanted to mull it over on recording in the back of my mind. But so when you, like, if you have a movie from, like, say the 70s that doesn't make it to theaters, like, what do you do with that movie? Like, there's no VHS, there's no DVD, there's no way to release it. Do you just, like, try and see if there's a small theater that will play it? Or, like, what do you do with it?
That's what I have to imagine. Or you take it on the road, I guess. Like, roadshow movies were still a thing in the 70s, you know, where you basically just have this print of the movie and you travel around the country. My roommate was explaining this to me because this was something I didn't have a lot of experience with. My roommate, is, maybe you can tell, is like a very big student of early Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
And he was explaining this to me, how there basically in those days you would have these going to the movies was like going to a play. Basically, this movie would be taken around the country on a journey, and it would only be showing at this one theater at this one time, and you would go and you would see it, and then like next week it would move on to the next city, and part of the reason why you did that was to drum up word of mouth, because as it got more successful, national publications would pick up on it, start publishing on it, and that's how you would kind of drum up support for the movie. So I'd have to imagine Reggio had something like that in mind.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know any of that.
And that's also why a lot of early movies, and movies even as late as 1960, 1970, had intermissions in them specifically, was because it was like going to a play. So the intermission is in there as an intermission.
Yeah. Also, I think that's interesting, because all that like kind of meshes together. That like informs the length of those old movies, because there's a ton of old movies that are like, man, this is like, you sit down and you're there for 3 to 4 hours. Like, yeah.
Looks like I was watching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang the other day, which is a movie from like 1968, I think. Or maybe 1950s. It was right after Mary Poppins. But anyway, that's a movie that's like 2 hours, 40 minutes almost, and it has an intermission. So
yeah, The Godfather did. One of them
The
did.
Godfather had an intermission. Once Upon a Time in America had an intermission. So it was very. And actually, I think one of the posters for Koyaanisqatsi kind of seems to indicate that this maybe still was kind of the case, because it talked about how on one specific night the Radio City Music Hall sold out because people wanted to experience this once in a lifetime event, and then it's like, but now you can experience it or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The Radio City Music Hall, as I found out watching all these old movies, was like a very big place to premiere your movie. Peter Bogdanovich was told by his mentor directors that if he had a movie play at the Radio City Music Hall, he had basically made it. And if he had a movie that sold out the Radio City Music Hall opening week, then he had definitely made it as a director. And he apparently found it very surreal when his movie What's Up Doc not only sold out the Radio City Music Hall, but had a line down the street of people trying to get in. So, old Hollywood, very interesting stuff.
Yeah. So I wonder how much George Lucas was actually involved in this, because his name gets slapped on the credits just like Coppola's, but I think maybe that's because he was involved with Coppola, like, whatchamacallit, like, business-wise.
Yeah, like we kind of indicated it, or explained in our Godfather episode earlier this season, that Lucas and Coppola were acquainted and worked together on projects. I read that George Lucas may have had like a little bit more of an input on Powaqqatsi, as opposed to Koyaanisqatsi. I did read an article that alleged that the beginning and the ending of Koyaanisqatsi is that shot of the cave paintings, I guess, the petroglyphs with the people, you know. I read that Francis Ford Coppola actually added that to the beginning and the end of the movie. I don't know how reliable that source is, but something to note, I guess. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first one, like we already have pretty much touched on, the first one came out, was somewhat of a big deal.
Yeah, part of the reason is because, and I can't believe we haven't mentioned this, Philip Glass's score to the movie,
right. Yeah,
which is
how
like
do
a
we go
really
this long
integral
without
part of all three of these movies, actually, because without dialogue, without anything, the score is what's really A, moving you through the movie, but B, telling you kind of what's going on in these scenes.
Kind of, and I remember, so Reggio actually came out and said that they screened an early version of the movie sometime in the late 70s. That like the footage was barely edited, and it didn't have any music or anything. And he said, well, one, that it was really bad, and two, that people hated it. So I think, yeah, and the fact that like this movie does move you through like this kind of story, even without like having narration or anything, is at least, if not more, at least like 50% of that is done by the music, if not more.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, it's very much an example of how the music and the visuals work together to create the movie, which I think is very interesting.
Right. Apparently, so I didn't know, but apparently Philip Glass is known for the sort of electronic, synthesized instruments type thing that we get here in this movie and in the second one, because like one of the very few things I actually found for the third one is that like it uses a more orchestral score, which is apparently not, Philip Glass's usual.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he's also like, I think part of that is that Koyaanisqatsi was the movie that really kind of was his big break, so to speak. Like he really starts to pick up steam as a composer after this movie, and he goes on to do like The Truman Show and various other big Hollywood productions. But this is kind of his first like big movie.
So, and the music for this, maybe even more so than the movie itself, has been like used in other things. I found a whole big list online. I don't really even remember what's on it though, but like the music from this movie has somehow been used in other things.
It's extremely iconic.
Yeah.
Extremely iconic. But yeah, like you said, the first one comes out was sort of a big deal. Reggio, I think, had always planned to do this as a trilogy. From what I understood of what I was reading, Reggio always wanted to do this as a trilogy. And Powaqqatsi was designed... Well, first off, Powaqqatsi is not a real Hopi word. It's a construction by Reggio of Qatsi, which is the Hopi word for life, and Pawak, I may be pronouncing this wrong, and if I do, I apologize, which apparently is like a Hopi word for, it roughly translates as like sorcerer.
Right. And this is true, just to get this out of the way, this is true of Koyaanisqatsi as well, right? That's not a real word in the Hopi language.
I think that one is actually an actual word in the Hopi language. From what I read, Kotsi and Naqoyqatsi are both actual Hopi words. Powaqqatsi isn't, partially because like its direct translation would be basically like sorcerer of life or something like that, and Reggio translates it as life is transformation. I believe Koyaanisqatsi is an actual Hopi word meaning life out of balance or life not in balance with its surroundings. We actually forgot to mention that Reggio really wanted to release the first movie without a title at all. He wanted to release Koyaanisqatsi without a title. He just wanted to release the movie as the movie. And the studio like wouldn't allow that. They're like, you have to have a title.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And
I mean, what would we call this if it didn't have it? We'd probably just call it like Godfrey Reggio, something, or refer to it with something like with his name or something.
It'd be like that
you know?
time Prince changed his name to that symbol. It's like, what do you say? I think the studio wanted to release it as like Koyaanisqatsi life out of balance or something, and I think a lot of people still refer to it as that today. And I think what I remember, and maybe I'm misremembering, is that Coppola was someone who was instrumental in Reggio, because Reggio was like, if you're going to release the movie, then it can only be this one word, right? It can just be this word. And Coppola was one of the people to throw his weight behind, like deleting the subtitle off of it and allowing him to just release it as the one word, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Powaqqatsi is not a real Hopi word. As far as I know, the other two are.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really find a lot about the second one, except I did Reggio talked about how he wanted the second one to be. The first one focuses a lot on like first world countries. He wanted the second one to be about like how the third world is treated by the first world, essentially. And apparently a lot of it was shot in South America, in the third world countries of South America, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I didn't find as much as I did for the first one either, and I didn't find too much for the first one, let me tell you. But what I sort of did find, I read some of the reception stuff from the time, read some actual reviews from newspapers and such at the time, and this one, as far as I could tell, wasn't received nearly as well as the first one.
No, yeah, the reception of the three definitely goes down through the three of them, which is interesting because I think I liked Naqoyqatsi better than Powaqqatsi, and I'll explain why later on. But the reception does go down. Koyaanisqatsi was basically Sean Connery. Was nearly universally well received as a movie. I think a lot of people applauded it for trying something new and succeeding, which is very difficult to do. Koyaanisqatsi also moves very quickly, it feels like. So.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about this probably in just a minute, but I feel like Koyaanisqatsi actually tells the story and like moves you through this story, whereas the other two struggle to do that, or perhaps don't try to do that. That was why I liked the first one better, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about that in a minute because I actually have a lot of thoughts about these movies. I know Ron Fricke for Powaqqatsi, basically, he said, we used a lot of time-lapse photography in Koyaanisqatsi, and for the second one, what I wanted to do was kind of do the opposite of that. So that's why there's a lot of slow-motion shots in Powaqqatsi, because Fricke wanted to... he had done the sped-up stuff, now he wanted to do the slow-down kind of stuff. And the movie starts and ends with these slow-motion scenes, and there's a lot, like, throughout the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And Philip Glass again returns, and that's really like pretty much everything I could find. But the second one definitely had the least troubled production because they got it out, like they made it and got it out in the shortest span of time. Koyaanisqatsi took 8 years. Naqoyqatsi took like 12.
Well, did they start Naqoyqatsi right after this? I don't know the answer to that.
From what I understand, yes. Or maybe not immediately right after, but within a couple years. So there was like a long 8 to 10 year gestation period on Naqoyqatsi.
But then didn't they also... I read a bit about this, but it's also evident just by watching the movie itself. Like they must have changed a good portion of it because of 9/11, which probably delayed it more. That's just speculation on my part, but like there's some stuff in there with that. So
yeah, Naqoyqatsi was one that apparently took a long time to make because they had a lot of budgetary problems getting the money to make it. And because of 9/11, I think there were changes that were made to the movie.
Mm-hmm.
According to Amazon, most of the... Okay, I'm going to back up just a sec because this needs some context. Unlike the first two movies, Naqoyqatsi is predominantly stock footage. Koyaanisqatsi and Powaqqatsi were both pretty much all new shot footage by Ron Fricke and Reggio. Naqoyqatsi is mostly stock footage, actually. According to Amazon, most of the stock footage is actually originally in the 4:3 aspect ratio, and Amazon then goes on to speculate that it's the intention of Reggio and Fricke to present it in 16:9 as kind of to make you uncomfortable, and also because the weirdness of it is like apparently part of the construction of it.
Yeah, that's interesting that like based on like the themes and stuff of this movie that like it's not really original. It's like this curated experience. You're just seeing this amalgamation of all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The footage in Naqoyqatsi is also much much more heavily edited than Koyaanisqatsi and
Oh yeah.
Powaqqatsi. And that makes me wonder, and this is obviously just speculation, makes me wonder if maybe part of the reason why this one took so long to make is because they didn't have the technology to do what Reggio wanted to do with the footage yet.
Well, it's also the when you talk about the budget for this one, like there's actual CG in this one.
Yeah.
And I imagine that like compared to other sort of big Hollywood movies or just like the huge movies that were coming out at the time, like the new Star Wars trilogy, Lord of the Rings and such, like getting a budget for a movie like this is probably insanely difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially since it had been, 15 years or 14 years since the last one came out.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, like, you have to wonder how the studio sat down, like, well, how many people are going to sit down and watch, like, a third Qatsi movie, right? We did it. I would definitely say it wasn't an unenjoyable experience, though.
It was an unenjoyable experience, or was it?
Wasn't.
I don't know. I mean, maybe we can transition now into talking about how these worked as a trilogy and some of our thoughts. But I don't know. I thought it kind of was an unenjoyable experience to some extent.
I mean, okay, so so my personal opinion is I enjoy Naqoyqatsi more than Powaqqatsi. Because, and let me explain why. I do think they both kind of drag a little bit. I think Naqoyqatsi and Koyaanisqatsi are interesting because Naqoyqatsi is almost a mirror of Koyaanisqatsi in every way possible. Koyaanisqatsi has a very electronic score. It's very artificial, but the shots in the movie are naturally created. It opens with the shots of the desert of, I think, New Mexico.
Right. We forgot to mention this, but they actually went to the, what's it called? Like the Four Corners or whatever, which I'm not sure if that's the actual name, but it's something like that. It's basically the place in the U.S. where 4 states like meet at one single point.
Yeah.
And I'll put it in the notes. I forget what the states are, but yeah, it'll be in the notes.
It's Colorado and New Mexico are 2 of them.
Yeah. Arizona, I think.
Yeah, I think it's Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah.
Probably. It'll be in the notes.
But yeah, so the Koyaanisqatsi is very natural. Shots of the cities, but it's presented from a very, like, this is what it is, motion, and then with the very electronic score, whereas Naqoyqatsi is kind of the opposite. Like, most of the movie is constructed artificially. The footage is edited, or it's negative, it's inverted or displayed
Matrix
in the
text.
Matrix text. It's displayed in the wrong aspect ratio, and then the score also flips. It's very orchestral. There's very few electronic components to the score. Yo-Yo Ma, the famous cellist, actually performs a good substantial portion of the score. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, I think the 2 of them as opposites is very interesting. Doesn't necessarily. I think Koyaanisqatsi is by far the most enjoyable one of the 3 to watch, because I think, like you said, it feels like there's an actual story running through the whole movie.
Even if it is like an abstract one, it kind of moves you from like these natural landscapes to cities and more urban environments, and then like shows you the speed up of like technology and life to the end, where you get that like dizzying, like just shots cut together so quickly, and it's stuff like that.
I described it to my roommate while we were watching it, because it speeds up and it speeds up, and then it just stops, and you get this shot that's just like literally floating, and everything is upside down and twisting and turning. Like it's the dissociation after the anxiety. You get really anxious, and it just builds and builds, and then just it breaks, and you just dissociate.
Yeah. So I mean, go on.
No, I was just say that's my favorite scene, like one of my favorite scenes in the first movie. Is all I had to say there.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite part of the entire trilogy. But one of the reasons why the first one feels a little more coherent, I think, than the second 2, is that, like, Reggio gave this sort of insight, like, this is a movie about how like language has failed to describe the world and stuff, and you can kind of see that in the movie. So as the movie goes on, you start to see more and more screens. There's like footage of screens, and then like at the end, like there's this moment where you go into those screens. So you're seeing like these video game arcade cabinets, these new like television screens with news and such. But eventually, like those overtake the entire screen. Like it's as if you're just watching like a news program or something. And that's like the simulacra, right? Like we're watching screens of screens, but eventually that just becomes, the screen. But that's kind of like, that's something that language has kind of done too, is like language was invented to describe the world around us. But like nowadays, and for thousands of years, like we don't like create language. We're just there. We're just come into it. Like we don't really have any choice. And like, how many times have you heard people say like, well, that's not what X means. The X word actually means this, and you're using it wrong. Whereas language is actually supposed to be descriptive rather than prescriptive, if that makes sense. So I can kind of see like those themes come into play in the movie.
Yeah, no, definitely. Those themes do, I think, appear in the other ones to a lesser extent. I think Powaqqatsi is interesting because it begins and it ends in these third world countries, and there's these scenes somewhat in the middle where it's all of a sudden you're watching screens again, and I was wondering after I finished it, I was like wondering if those shots are nearly almost exactly in the middle of the film, kind of forming like allowing the third world scenes to bookend basically this technology driven first world. I mean, there is, Reggio did say that Powaqqatsi is about the third world, but also he explicitly says it's about what he tried to represent is the treatment of the third world by the first world. And I think you can kind of see that too, because you open with all these shots of people basically lifting rocks out of a gravel pit, essentially, and then you end up later on, you see this machinery doing that. So you're like, well, what's the comparison you're led to draw here? In my opinion, the reason why Powaqqatsi is less interesting is because a lot of the shots are very samey, if that makes sense. A lot of them are very similar in construction and content. Koyaanisqatsi, I think, and Naqoyqatsi to a much lesser extent, did a good job of varying the locations, varying from scene to scene. Even if we saw, if we saw New York for 20 minutes in the movie, we didn't see New York from the same angle for 20 minutes. Powaqqatsi has a lot of shots of, and maybe this is just a limitation of the fact that everywhere that they filmed in South America looked pretty much the same, but Powaqqatsi has a lot of shots that are like, is the same, in my opinion.
Maybe that has something to do with like how technology like speeds up life, and like places that like have access to and have like not as much tech, or like life is a lot slower, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, one of the most interesting shots in the movies to me is in the Naqoyqatsi, where I think it kind of plays into what you were saying with the screens, watching screens, and this technology bent that society has, but it's a shot where it's the red carpet and it's a limo pulls up and everyone's taking pictures of the celebrities that get out of the limo, but all the celebrities are computer-generated women.
Right. That was actually a funny scene to me, because early on in the movie, there's like this, it looks almost like some sort of computer simulation of like tectonic, shifts and stuff, where you see like a mountain come out of the ground, and it's not like, the animation of it is not very good. And then you see this scene later with these CG animated models, and it's like, oh, that's where their CG budget went. Well, like, unless that's stock footage, I don't know.
Well, also what I think is interesting is that the CG is kind of, I almost think, supposed to be bad in the Koyaanisqatsi. Like, you're supposed to notice that it's CG because the point is that CG is taking over everything.
Yes.
And for that to work, you need to notice that it's computer generated.
From a distance, I actually didn't, though. Like, when the limousine first pulled up and the woman got out of it, I didn't know that it was CG until they zoomed in on the faces, and I was like, oh, okay.
And that's interesting. Like, maybe that's part of the ploy. Like, maybe that's the idea. I mean, you can draw again whatever you want from it, but
Yeah.
like that's something I would draw from it. Is like from a distance, we're living in this simulate, but like when you get to the fine grained details, technology is like taking over. My favorite shot in all three movies is in the Qatsi actually, which is the shot of it's all these classical painting, these Renaissance and classical era paintings, and they're like quickly morphing between all of them. Like it morphs from the painting to the painting. You don't actually recognize what the painting is before it's like already morphing into the next one. I just thought that whole scene was like so cool.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. I mean, there were a few that you can like easily pick up on. I think Einstein is in there. There were a couple other ones that was like, okay, I know who that is.
Yeah, there was
Queen Elizabeth is in there.
one of the famous Venus paintings was in there that I recognized, you know. But I just thought that shot was really cool. I really enjoy. I mean, I'm not sure what it's saying. That all art becomes the same when we have computers to do it for us. I don't know.
Meh. I mean, I don't know.
This is the one other thing about Koyaanisqatsi that I noticed while I was watching it is that the order of shots is also very deliberate. You get these shots at the very beginning. You see these waves, shots of wave, and then you cut to these time-lapse photography of the clouds, and then the clouds look very similar to the waves. Obviously, this mental connection is what the ordering of the shots is implying, and that continues the whole movie. You see like a lot of rivers. At least I felt like I saw a lot of rivers, and then you see like
in the beginning,
in the beginning, and then you see later on you see time-lapse photography of the highways, and the cars almost look like water streaming down the road.
So I guess unless you have anything else to add, like how does this work as a trilogy?
I just have one thing that I just realized I forgot for Koyaanisqatsi for behind-the-scenes information. I'm just gonna throw in you real quick that they did a lot of the kind of ghostly scenes, and this is in Powaqqatsi too, is that they did that using a double exposure technique where they exposed the film. Well, how did they do this? Especially for the time lapses, one of the scenes in Koyaanisqatsi was a scene where these cars look kind of ghostly, and apparently what they did was they shot a 2-hour time lapse during the day, and they double exposed the film by reshooting a 20-minute time lapse during the night over the same section of footage, and that's why the cars look so ghostly.
Isn't that pretty risky? Can you ruin the film doing that?
Yeah, so double exposing film is actually there's a risk involved, but if you do it correctly, it's actually pretty easy to do. You basically just need to stop. You need to the first time you expose, you need to underexpose by a stop. So just to get just a very slight technical bit in here, a stop basically. An increase of one stop doubles the amount of light that comes in and hits the film. So you need to underexpose both shots by a stop so that the double exposed shot is correctly exposed. Because if you shoot them both at regular exposure, then you run the risk of overexposing the film, and then you get nothing. So
yeah, interesting.
But yeah, that was the last thing I wanted to know. So yeah, we can talk about how they work as a trilogy now.
Well, I didn't pick up on a lot of the stuff that you did, I think. So I was ready to come in here and say they didn't work well as a trilogy at all. And I still, to some extent, think that they don't. Especially, regardless of the content and the themes and all that stuff, I just think the first one is so much more enjoyable to watch that the second two feel like a drag. And I think that drags down the trilogy as a whole. Because one, like something interesting is that like when I first started watching Koyaanisqatsi, I thought it was going to be like a total slog. I thought I would hate it. I mean, I actually didn't. So that got my expectations up higher for the second two, but the second two ended up being kind of what I thought the first one would be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I'm inclined to agree that because the second two feel a little bit of a drag, that they don't necessarily work great as a trilogy. I do think that thematically there are a lot of ties between the movies, but I think that visually and story-wise, because Philip Glass's score, I don't know, I was actually underwhelmed by his score for Powaqqatsi. I'm gonna be brutally honest here. I was actually kind of underwhelmed.
I was underwhelmed by the second two score as well. I think overall the reason why I was underwhelmed in general by Powaqqatsi and Naqoyqatsi is that like Koyaanis was a lot better than I thought it would.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. I could definitely see that. I think they work okay. I guess my kind of opinion is that they work okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I definitely think Koyaanisqatsi is the golden child, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I told my roommate about this, and he's like, "Well, I guess there's a reason why everybody knows the first one and doesn't even know the other two exist, because he didn't even know the other two existed."
Right.
So
it's actually, so I'm looking on, according to Wikipedia here, it's actually Naqoyqatsi. That's how you would pronounce it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Naqoy. Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. That might not be exact, but I think that at least the emphasis is on the first syllable there.
Yeah, well, he puts the pronunciations at the end of the movies with the definition.
Right.
The first one also seems to have a very clear message, because at the end of the movie, there's also, during the score, there was a choir kind of chanting these Hopi prophecies that at the end of the movie it reveals to you like what they mean or what they translate to, and that kind of, I think, helps direct the story of the movie, where we didn't have that in the other two.
Right. Yeah, I'm about out of everything I had to say.
Yeah, I'm pretty much tapped out. I know we usually talk about expanded universe stuff, and there's not much, but I do want to mention another movie actually that Reggio made between Powaqqatsi and, what was it?
Naqoyqatsi.
Called Anima Mundi, which is a movie I think he was commissioned to make, and celebrates the biological diversity campaign of the WWF. And it uses shots of, it's basically very similar in construction to these movies, but doesn't obviously talk about technology. It uses shots of nature and animals to evoke some feeling about, loving the earth and all that. So it's not obviously part of this trilogy, but Koyaanisqatsi.org includes it as, I don't remember the exact wording they use, but something like tangential to the trilogy or related in some way, because it's very similar in construction, and released between Powaqqatsi and Naqoyqatsi.
Yeah, I'm just looking up his filmography right now. It looks like he directed something called Patricia's Park in 1989.
I have no idea.
It's a music video by a band. Song. Huh. Okay, well, I don't really know what this is, and I don't think I want to spend the time reading what it is on this recording, but I might put some of this in the notes. He also directed a movie in 2013 called Visitors.
I don't know what that's about at all.
It's, according to Wikipedia, Visitors is a 2013 American documentary film written and directed by Godfrey Reggio, exploring humanity's trance-like relationship with technology.
So, the same kind of similar stuff.
Right. Philip Glass, again, did the music.
Of course. A combination of a lifetime, really.
Yep, no dialogue, just like the Qatsi movies. So, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, Anima Mundi is only 28 minutes, and he also did a 7-minute short film called Evidence before Naqoyqatsi as well.
Yeah, you got to wonder, like, I know this barely has anything directly to do with this, but like you got to wonder for these directors and writers and such, like when you go 10 years without making a big movie, like how do you make money? Like, like, and I know, okay, so actually I can't believe I didn't mention this, but the reason Ron Fricke moved to LA in the late 70s is because, so when he moved to LA in the late 70s, he couldn't find a job in Hollywood, so he actually just worked as a waiter. Mm-hmm. So it's like, man, like, I don't know. How do people survive for like 10 years without making a movie if you're a filmmaker?
Probably, I don't know. I assume Reggio had his, like, maybe, I don't know if the IRE still exists, but something similar. Some company that he was running at the time.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of directors will just become like producers or, slap their name on movies. Boom. Steven Soderbergh, like Francis Ford Coppola, puts his name on Naqoyqatsi to get it the wide release that Reggio wanted. So there's another like famous director slapping his name on this movie to get it released.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, Reggio clearly, he didn't die or like drop off the face of the earth. He came back, so clearly he had something going, or maybe he just made so much money off of like the Kotsi Trilogy that he was just like kicking his feet up.
Maybe, yeah.
Ron Ficki would go on to become a director in his own right. Also, maybe the reason why Powaqqatsi and Naqoyqatsi don't, feel the same is because Ron Ficki actually isn't the cinematographer for Naqoyqatsi, as far as I know. He, I think he was a camera operator, but because most of the movie was stock footage,
right.
He wasn't really involved.
Right.
So, but yeah, interesting. I think Koyaanisqatsi was recently added to the Criterion collection, which is a what is it? What is they basically just do upscale, retransfers of old movies, not necessarily old anymore, but movies that they consider culturally important, and they basically get all the director's input, and it's approved by the director, and they do a lot of behind the scenes stuff. So I figure if you want more of this, go buy the Criterion collection of these 3 movies, because I was looking at the special features, and they've got like multiple hours of documentary features on the making of these movies on there. So, and you get to see them on Blu-ray, I guess.
Yeah.
So I guess on that note, we're closing out season 3 of Triple Play.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if we announced this earlier in the season, like if we planned this in the middle of the season, but I wanted to move it to the end of the season, partially because of the nice mirroring with Francis Ford Coppola being involved, but also because I felt like ending the season on something like Triple X would be really underwhelming from a movie point of view. So
maybe, yeah.
So yeah, that's season 3 of Triple Play in the bag. And, if you would like to email us, you can reach us thedoctor@decoratevegetable.com. Questions, comments, concerns, angry rants, love letters, your thoughts on any of the movies we've watched this season, any of the movies we're watching next season. You can find us on YouTube at Decorative Vegetable, find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify, all at Triple Play. Be sure to leave a rating if you like the show, and obviously soon we'll be returning with Inevitable again. Right,
our classic sci-fi podcast that we do in between seasons of this. So check that out. Also check us out on Facebook, Trust Your Doctor. Like us on Facebook. Also check us out on Twitter at TYD Podcast, and follow us on Twitter. And until season 4, the end.